Did angels breed with women? In Genesis chapter 6, it says that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and took wives from them. And it is a very popular view that these sons of God, obviously distinguished from the daughters of men in context, were angels, if you will, rebel angels, fallen angels, that procreated with human women. Furthermore, in Genesis chapter 6, it says that there were Nephilim in those days and afterwards. The King James says giants. And it's talking about the age leading up to the flood of Noah. And so it is believed that these Nephilim, or giants, were the hybrid offspring of the angel-human relationships. Furthermore, this is based upon the idea that the sons of God is a phrase that refers seemingly to angels in other passages. And also that in 2 Peter chapter 2, Peter tells us that God did not spare the angels that had sinned, but cast them down to hell or the pit. And alongside this, in context, it mentions the ancient world of Noah. So does the term sons of God refer to angels in Genesis chapter 6? Well, I don't believe so. I think there are way too many problems with this interpretation, and it's based upon a lot of speculation. So let me tell you the numerous problems I find with this interpretation, and then I will offer you what I think is a much more reasonable understanding of the passage. First, the term sons of God refers to people as well throughout the Bible, in fact, more so, such as Matthew chapter 5, verse 9, Luke 3:38, Romans 8:14 and 19, and Galatians 3 and 26. In Psalm 82 and verse 6, referring to humans, in fact, it says they would be called the sons of the Most High. In Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 5, it refers to God's people as His children, which would be His sons. So there may be other passages that refer to angels as sons of God, but not near as many as actually is applied to people in the Bible. One problem with the 2 Peter chapter 2 passage that mentions angels being cast down into the pit by God, the angels who rebelled, is it doesn't really make any connection to these sons of God in Genesis chapter 6. It is true that the context also mentions a reference to the ancient world of Noah. It never actually says these are the sons of God mentioned in chapter 6. It says nothing about Nephilim, nothing about giants. So there's nothing really here. It's possibly an allusion, but again, never actually makes the connection to Genesis chapter 6 and the sons of God. Another problem is that it says that they married these women, took wives in verse 2. But why would rebel angels be interested in marriage? I mean, it says that they saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful. But if these rebel angels were going to be so rebellious as to procreate with human women, are they at the same time going to be virtuous enough that they're going to not do it without marrying them? What interest would they have with marriage? But someone may object that the term for took wives is a term that could also simply mean took women. So maybe it's not even speaking about marriage. That's a fair objection, but there are numerous other problems to go. One of the biggest problems, perhaps the biggest problem that I find with the text comes from the mouth of Jesus Christ Himself. In Mark chapter 12 and verse 25, Jesus refers to those who attain the age of resurrection and says that they will not marry, but they will be like the angels in heaven. So the angels do not marry. But I just said, though, that the term taking wives could just be taking women. And it is also objected that Jesus refers to the angels in heaven, not angels that came down here and rebelled. But both of these miss the real point of what I'm trying to get across here. But Jesus said that the angels do not marry, the angels in heaven. But none of the angels were made to be rebels, of course, so none of them were designed to marry. That being the case, they furthermore would not have been designed to procreate. So would God give these spirits, angels, who He had no plan for them to marry, the desire to procreate, to sleep with human women? See, this is a very problematic and speculative position. But Jesus said the angels do not marry. And even if it's a reference to the ones that haven't rebelled, the ones in heaven, it only shows that God did not create them to procreate because He did not create them to marry. So where did they get these desires to do it in the first place? Would they have had the desires, but God never intended them to be fulfilled within marriage? And so the next problem arises, how did these spirits who were never designed to procreate do so. They're not humans. They do not have flesh. Every angel in the Bible that appears as a man is a good angel, if you will. It is not a rebel angel, not a fallen angel, but angels that are carrying messages for God. Are we to believe that fallen angels that become rebels were able to become human beings physically? One would just simply have to speculate that they did in fact, when the text doesn't say anything about any of that. It is just speculation that rebel angels could, outside of the will of God, become human beings. On top of that is another problem. If the Nephilim, or the giants from the King James, is the hybrid offspring of this relationship, then how does that work, considering that the angels, according to the theory, became human beings? If they became human beings, then wouldn't the offspring be human? How do they become hybrids? Now one has to speculate that in becoming human beings, these angels had to still retain some of their supernatural properties. And even if they did, how did that translate to their own DNA being mixed with human DNA and becoming hybrid? This is way too much speculation for this to be a reasonable interpretation. Another problem is what Jesus says in Luke chapter 24 about his resurrection. In Luke 24, Jesus has risen from the dead already, and he appears to the disciples who are terrified at seeing him all of a sudden. It says they were terrified and supposed that they had seen a spirit. And he said unto them, Why are you troubled, and why do thoughts arise in your hearts? Behold my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Handle me, and see. For a spirit hath not flesh and bones, as you see me have. And when he had spoken, he showed them his hands and his feet. So Jesus is saying that I'm not a spirit because spirits don't have what I have, which is flesh and bone, which is why he had them feel him, because he wanted to show I'm a real body standing here. I'm not a spirit. But if these rebel angels who are spirits could easily put on flesh and bone, then all of a sudden his statement about that he's not a spirit doesn't seem quite as strong. They could easily say, well, no, spirits can take human flesh and bone. That's what the angels did back in Genesis chapter 6. Another possible problem is that in Acts chapter 17 and verse 26, Paul the Apostle says that God made all the nations from one blood. This refers to Adam. But in his day, we have every reason to believe that the descendants of the Nephilim were still around. And the Bible never mentions that they ceased to be at any point. So the descendants carried on after the flood, but Paul says that God made all nations from one blood. But if you have these hybrid offspring of angels, then you've got supernatural blood coming in there. You've got a blood that is mixed with some supernatural blood that came from the angels. But over and over in Genesis chapter 6, it makes reference to humans, men. In verse 4, it says the Nephilim, or the giants, were men of renown, meaning well-known men. In verse 5, it says that the wickedness of man was great on the earth. This is why God flooded it and destroyed them. But it says the wickedness of man. It says in verse 6 that God was sorry that he made man on the earth. And in verse 7 that he was going to blot out man from the earth. But one of the big problems, supposedly, is that angels interfered. Angels came down and intermarried, but not a word is uttered about angels or supernatural creatures. God is angry with men. Seems awfully unfair that all the blame is put on men when it was the angels that came down and became men. So these aren't angels, these are men. These are human beings that we are talking about. In verse 4, the King James says giants. This is a very troublesome word translated as giants, and does not necessarily mean giants as the King James says. Scholars are not really sure exactly what the word Nephilim means, but there's no real evidence that refers to giants. Other passages that refer to the Anakites, the descendants of the Nephilim, does make reference to there being very large people. But that doesn't mean that was all of them, but perhaps these particular descendants. But there is no real evidence that they were ever giants in the first place. Furthermore, verse 4 of Genesis 6 says that they were on the earth in those days. It does not actually say that these were the offspring of the sons of God and daughters of men. It just says that they were on the earth in those days. But there is no actual statement that proves that these were the offspring of these relationships. So the whole position is really based upon a lot of speculation, things that are never stated in the text, and assumptions. But I believe that there's a much more reasonable interpretation of this passage. I believe that the sons of God refers to the righteous men marrying daughters from among those who were not righteous. And the more this happened, the more the population became corrupted. We've already seen that the term sons of God can refer to God's own people. In the context leading up to chapter 6, chapter 4, and chapter 5, you have the corruption, the fall of mankind. In chapter 4, you see Cain, who becomes a murderer of his brother, and it also speaks of his lineage. But then at the end of chapter 4, you see Seth born to Eve, and thus a new lineage begins to spring forth after Abel had already been killed. In fact, it says in verse 25 that Eve said, "God has set for me another seed in place of Abel, for Cain killed him." So evidently, Eve did not have a lot of men, but she had mostly daughters. But here is Seth, and now a new lineage springs forth, and it even says in verse 26, "Then men began to call upon the name of Yahweh." Men began to call out to God and to seek Him for their own salvation, to seek Him for mercy. And so after Seth is born, this is a description of what is said about men. As you go through the lineage of Seth in chapter 5, it mentions men like Enoch, who was a very righteous man. And Noah himself, a righteous man, came from the same lineage. Now, I'm not saying that the total lineage of Seth was righteous and the total lineage of Cain was evil. I'm saying that it's more than likely that most righteous men came from the influence of those in Seth's lineage, and that the majority of Cain's lineage was wicked. But this is just generally speaking. And then you come to Genesis 6, where we have the sons of God, which were those who were righteous, began to intermarry with those who were not seeking after God, those who were not calling upon the name of God. Well, we know from the Bible that God often restricted His people from marrying certain pagan women because He says that it would corrupt them. And this happened quite often. An obvious example of this is Solomon, who was a very righteous king, who had so many pagan wives that it says they turned away his heart from following after God. So that this does in fact happen. And so we come to Genesis chapter 6, where it is much more plausible that the righteous, the sons of God, intermarried with the families of those who were not seeking after God, were not following God, and thus were influenced. And as time went on, the generations became more corrupt until ultimately most of the earth was in fact corrupt and filled with violence. The strength of this position is that it does not have near as much speculation. Also, it follows the actual context of the chapters that came before Genesis chapter 6. So ultimately, the popular view of angels becoming men is possible, but not very plausible. I think is way too problematic and speculative. But the idea that the sons of God are righteous men intermarrying with the daughters of corrupted families until ultimately it corrupts most of humankind, until God wipes them out, I think is a much more justifiable interpretation of the text. But ultimately, you have to read for yourself and come to your own conclusion.